curve is a representative of inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So you are expected to draw your Phillips curve that is downward sloping, but then it should bend inward. On your vertical axis is the interest rate, is the inflation rate. On your horizontal axis is the unemployment rate. So, what does the guy say? The guy by the name Philip. The guy says there is a negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So the question says you use a graph as an instrument of the demand side policy. So here we need to show the effects from the demand side policy. If, for instance, this is the demand side policy, we will use a classical demand and supply graph. If, for instance, the price at P naught and the quantity at Q naught equals to the inflation rate of, let's say it's 5%. At this point, at the price of 5, we've got a 5% inflation rate. And the unemployment rate, for instance, is, let's say it's 25. So, if there's an increase in the demand for goods, we use a demand side policy. There will be a rightward shift of the demand curve. We can see a shift from D to D1. What happens to the prices? What happens to the prices when there is an increase in the demand for goods? The prices increase to P, let's say P2. And then the quantity. What happens to the quantity? The quantity will increase. We can move from A to B. What happens to the inflation that we are talking about? Because the sole aim is to explain the Phillips curve. So what happens to the inflation rate when the prices are high or when the demand for goods are high? What happens to the inflation rate?
It increases.
It increases. We can see from, let's say, from 5 to 7%. What happens to the level of unemployment? What happens to the level of unemployment when there is an increase in the inflation rate?
Decreases.
Unemployment decreases from 25, let's say 20. What happens to the Phillips curve? We see a movement from A to, the movement actually comes from this side. We say B to A. On the other hand, because we see an increase in the demand for goods will increase the inflation. But then will reduce the unemployment rate. If, for example, there is a decrease in the demand for goods, let's say the government increases taxes, there's an increase in personal income tax, what will happen to the demand for goods in the economy? This is the goods market. What will happen?
Decrease.
It will decrease. Which curve will shift? The demand curve will shift to the left. Because of the increase in taxes. And then we've got, let's say, D3. What happens to the prices? The prices decrease. The quantity decrease. We've got a movement from A, we'll say C. What happens to the Phillips curve? Okay, what happens to the inflation rate when the prices are lower? What happens to the inflation rate? The inflation rate will decrease. From 5, we say 3%. What happens to the unemployment rate when the inflation rate is lower? Unemployment rate will increase. We say from 25 to 30. And then we see a movement along the Phillips curve. That would be our point C. So, this is the problem that the guy by the name Phillips has recognized with the use of demand-side policy. He says that when we increase the prices, the demand for goods, it will increase at the expense of unemployment. On the other hand, the Phillips curve can be shown by the supply-side policy. The supply-side policy is what we are interested in. Is the inflation that comes from the supply side when the cost of production increases. There will be an inflation and unemployment rate, and we'll see a rightward shift of the Phillips curve. Can we show that in a graph? Let me just... Now we are going to use a Phillips curve showing a supply side approach. Supply D, and then we've got our quantity, we've got our price. Okay, let's say the price is P0 and the inflation rate is 5%. What happens when the cost of production increases? Which curve is affected? It's the supply curve.
Yes.
Will shift to which side? To the left, showing higher prices. Okay, let's say the employees are bargaining for higher wages. That will increase the cost of production. The other factor that can increase the cost of production would be the natural disasters. If, for instance, there is a drought, that will cost the producers, and the supply curve will shift to the left. On the other hand, when there is a decrease in technology, that can also lead to an increase in the cost of production. So when the cost of production increases, we see a leftward shift of the supply curve from S to S1. What happens to the prices? The prices will increase from P to P1. what happens to the employment rate, or what happens to the demand for goods when the prices increase because of the cost of production? What happens to the quantity? It decreases from Q to Q1. Okay, we see the inflation rate risen from 5% to 7%. There is an inflation because of the cost of production. What happens to the employment level? What happens to the employment level when there is a? What happens to the employment level when there is an inflation? When there is an increase in the cost of production, what happens to the employment level? The employment level will decrease. We can see from the diagram. This movement from A to B shows a decrease from Q to Q1 because the quantity is also known as the output or the employment. So when the employment level decreases, what happens to the unemployment level? What happens to the unemployment rate when the employment levels increase? Sorry, decrease. There is a decrease in employment level. What happens to the unemployment level? Increase. So how can that be shown with the Phillips curve? Can you see? We cannot see the inverse relationship. There's an increase in the cost of production. There's an increase in the inflation rate. And then we need to show in this graph, in this Phillips curve, an increase in the employment level, in the unemployment level. How can we do that? We have to shift this graph to the right. And then from this 7%, we need to shift it like this. This point shows higher inflation rate. It also shows higher unemployment rate. So this point will be showing higher inflation rate and higher employment rate. You will then shift your Phillips curve to the right. You'll say you've got P1. Then this shows a shift. So what is the distinction? What is the difference between the demand side and the supply side approach towards the Phillips curve? Okay, the demand side approach make movements along the Phillips curve. I can say one. But the supply side approach makes a shift of the Phillips curve. Do you understand it? The reason we see a shift is because when there is a inflation from the supply side, there is a higher inflation rate and higher unemployment rate. You can see the prices are higher, showing inflation. The quantity of goods is lower, showing lower employment rate. And there's a negative relationship between employment and unemployment. When the employment decreases, unemployment increases. So that is how we illustrate Phillips curve with the use of a diagram. So you are expected to draw this graph, you then comment, you then say all what we have illustrated in this graph. Firstly, in A, when you comment, we constantly comment. You say a Phillips curve is a relationship between unemployment and inflation. Do we agree with that? Yes, it's an inverse relationship. It's unemployment and inflation rate. Number 2, you say Phillips curve shows an initial point. We see an initial point at point A. And a second point, point B, shows higher unemployment and inflation rate. You then say we can use demand side and supply side approach to show Phillips curve. Lastly, you say as unemployment decreases, inflation rate is likely to increase. Can we see that? When the unemployment rate decreases from 30 to 25, the inflation rises from 5 to 7%. That is how you were expected to illustrate the Phillips curve with the diagram.